Hello, it's Wednesday, September 30th, the last day of September. I'm Ann Fenlason, pastor of Trinity Lutheran Church in Long Lake, Minnesota. It's an ELCA congregation, and thank you for stopping by today. So this week's theme is communion, based on the fact that we had First Communion this past Sunday for our young people. A very special day in the life of faith, one that we, as people who have taken communion for decades, one that we can continue to celebrate every time we take communion. So, as I mentioned before, I think we need to just keep reminding ourselves how amazing this sacrament is. And remember, a sacrament is an ordinary earthly element into which God's word is spoken and it is made holy. This happens in baptism with the water and in communion with the bread and the wine. And in John, there is something called the Bread of Life discourse. It happens fairly early in John chapter 6, with Jesus talking to people around him about his body and blood. And he talks about how people are to eat and drink his flesh and his blood. And I remember that I had the opportunity to preach on that text. It's called the Bread of Life discourse, fancy term for that, where Jesus talks about how he is the bread of life, and how those who eat and drink will never be hungry or thirsty again. So I preached on this text when I was on my internship year in seminary. That's back when seminary was 4 years long, and one of those years was an internship year. I was at a local congregation. And a couple days after I preached on that, there was a fellow in our congregation who, when he and his wife were on their way home from church, they would chat with their boys, young boys, but very, very smart boys. They would chat about what they heard in worship and if there's anything that stuck out to them. And one of their boys, of course, eating and drinking Jesus' flesh and blood, really struck a chord with him, and he's like, ew. He thought that was kind of weird or gross or odd, and so they talked about that. And yeah, it does strike our ears in an interesting way. It gets our attention, but the thing about taking communion is that this is Jesus abiding with us. It even says in that text that he abides with us when we take him into our bodies. And abide means to dwell. Someone who is living with us, abiding within us. We take Jesus into a cellular level when we take Holy Communion. And remember, it binds all of us as the communion of saints, past, present, and future. I am reading this little pamphlet that's put out by Augsburg. It's created by Dan Erlander, a pastor. And it has a really nice way of talking about what we Lutherans believe. There are, I think, 5 or 6 pamphlets in this series. One on baptism, of course, one on the Reformation, and on it goes. But he talks about God coming to us in this meal of bread and wine, and reminds us that when Jesus was born, he came to us in human form. And Holy Communion is the time and the place when Jesus shows up in the earthly elements of bread and wine. This is something very special for us. And also in communion, we receive the promise of Christ's forgiveness, his grace upon grace, that abundant grace that we hear John talk about in his gospel. And the fact that he tells us that he will never leave us. He will be with us always. We are granted everlasting life through Christ himself. But one of the portions of this book, let me see if I can, there we go. So here's, in the sacraments, God comes to us in the very ordinary, yes, the bread and the wine of Holy Communion. And there's a question here, are we really eating Jesus? Let me read that to you. Yes, we trust him when he says, "This is my body." We claim no secret knowledge of exactly how God makes this possible. The bread and wine of communion carry God's word of forgiveness past our lips as well as beyond our limited understanding. We take Jesus at his word. We eat the meal. We get the gift. Chew on that. Folks, we can always take Jesus at his word. We can trust that. So go into this day and chew on that gift that Jesus gives us of abiding with us always. We'll see you at church on Sunday, hopefully. Have a great week. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.